2:14 a.m., inside the quiet halls of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York. A nurse checked on a patient who had been recovering well just hours before. The monitors were steady, the charts were clean. Then suddenly, without warning, the patient went into cardiac arrest. Alarms blared. Staff rushed in, performing CPR, calling for assistance. But it was too late. The man was dead. The cause? Unknown. His vitals had been stable, and there was no medical reason for his sudden collapse. The only thing anyone could remember was that a resident physician named Michael Swango had been in the room just minutes earlier. A few days later, in another ward, another patient died under strikingly similar circumstances. Again, the same doctor had been on duty. Across the next few months, whispers began spreading through the hospital corridors. Nurses spoke quietly about strange coincidences, about the times patients seemed to deteriorate immediately after routine injections. Some said they noticed Swango carrying his own medical bag everywhere, even when off duty. By the time administrators began to look into it, Swango was gone, vanished from the hospital, moving on to another state, another name, another opportunity to start again. This was not the first time unexplained deaths followed him, and it would not be the last. To understand how Michael Swango became one of the most prolific medical killers in modern history, we have to go back to his beginnings, to the hospitals that trusted him, and to the institutions that looked the other way. Welcome back to Tales from the Niger. Today's story promises to hold you spellbound till the very end. Stay with me as I walk you through the twists and turns of this insane thriller. If you have not yet subscribed, please remember to hit the subscribe button and also leave a like on this video to help the channel out. Thank you very much. Now, let's get straight into it. Michael Joseph Swango was born on October 21, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington. But he grew up in Quincy, Illinois, a quiet Midwestern town on the banks of the Mississippi River. The second of three sons, he was raised in what, at first glance, seemed like a normal American family. His father, John Virgil Swango, was a career U.S. Army officer, a Vietnam veteran who struggled with alcoholism and long absences. His mother, Muriel, was strict, protective, and often at odds with her husband. From an early age, Michael learned to keep to himself. He was brilliant, focused, and fiercely competitive. At Quincy Catholic Boys High School, he excelled in academics, graduated as valedictorian, and was known for his precision and discipline. Teachers described him as driven to win at all costs. Classmates remembered a quiet young man who sometimes made others uneasy with his intensity. He played the clarinet in the school band, ran track, and seemed destined for success. After high school, Swango joined the Marine Corps. There, his obsession with order and perfection deepened. He thrived on physical endurance, meticulous routines, and strict hierarchies. When he later entered Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, he brought that same Marine mentality into the world of medicine. Structured, efficient, but unnervingly detached. At SIU, his academic record was stellar, top of his class, active in leadership roles, and admired by some faculty. But among his peers, there was unease. They called him a gunner, a student who would do anything to get ahead. Some noticed odd behavior, impatience with patients, coldness during rounds, and an obsession with medical emergencies and death. During his clinical rotations, these unsettling traits began to surface more clearly. Nurses and classmates whispered about the strange pattern. Patients assigned to Swango would suddenly go into distress. One student later recalled how they jokingly called him 00 Swango, a play on 007. Because, as they said, his patients never seemed to make it out alive. It was a dark nickname, but it carried a trace of truth. The first real warning came during his obstetrics rotation. He repeatedly failed to document patient care properly, and his supervisors noted his erratic behavior. At one point, a duffel bag of his spilled open, revealing containers labeled taro ant killer, which were found to contain arsenic compounds. Though deeply suspicious, the incident was brushed aside. Faculty discussions debated whether he should be expelled, but the consensus leaned toward leniency. No one wanted to derail the career of a promising medical student over what seemed like unproven rumors. Meanwhile, the strange episodes continued. Patients under Swango's care would recover one moment and then crash inexplicably the next. Notes went missing, lab results were altered, yet no definitive proof ever tied him directly to wrongdoing. The faculty's inaction reflected a broader flaw in medical oversight, an institution unwilling to confront its own. By the time Swango graduated in 1983, the unease surrounding him had become almost folklore among his classmates. A brilliant student, yes, but one surrounded by whispers of death. To his professors, he was simply another young doctor entering the field. But to those who had watched closely, Michael Swango represented something far darker. A warning that brilliance without conscience could become a weapon. And soon he would carry that weapon into hospitals across America. After finishing his medical internship under a cloud of suspicion, Michael Swango returned home to Quincy, Illinois. But rather than a hospital, he found work with the Adams County Ambulance Service as a paramedic. It was 1983, and despite his medical degree, he was now back where he had started, working on emergency calls, treating trauma victims, and earning the trust of the paramedics around him. To his colleagues, Swango was strange but competent. He was the kind of man who double-checked his supplies obsessively, kept to himself, and always seemed calm under pressure. He carried notebooks filled with detailed logs and medical references, as though constantly studying. But before long, the crew began to notice something disturbing. When Swango brought coffee or snacks to share, several colleagues would suddenly fall violently ill. It started subtly, a few bouts of nausea, dizziness, and stomach cramps. Then it became undeniable. One paramedic collapsed in the break room after drinking coffee Swango had offered. Another vomited uncontrollably after sharing a donut with him. At first, the team chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe food poisoning, maybe bad coffee, but the pattern was clear. Someone always got sick when Swango was around food or drink. The men began to avoid eating anything he touched. Some joked nervously that he was trying to kill them. Others began taking samples of what he prepared and saving them just in case. Soon their suspicions reached the Quincy Police Department. Investigators launched an inquiry and searched Swango's home and car. What they found shocked them. Inside his vehicle were bottles labeled ant poison, taro ant killer, and several unmarked containers containing traces of arsenic and other toxic substances. He also had clippings and notes about poisons, chemical compounds, and their effects on the human body.
Laboratory testing confirmed what his colleagues had feared. The coffee that made them sick contained arsenic. Swango was arrested and charged with aggravated battery. During his trial in 1985, prosecutors presented evidence of poison purchase records, medical analysis of the substances found, and testimonies from co-workers who had been hospitalized after consuming his drinks. Swango insisted on his innocence, claiming he was being framed by jealous co-workers. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Even behind bars, he maintained his air of superiority, writing letters about medical theory and working as a prison medic, where other inmates reported mysterious illnesses after interacting with him. His sentence would mark only the beginning of a deadly career that would stretch across hospitals and continents. When Swango was released in 1987, most believed that his career in medicine was over, but he was determined to return to hospitals. Changing his name and falsifying paperwork, he managed to secure medical positions again, first in small facilities, then in major institutions. One of the most haunting episodes took place years earlier during his internship at Ohio State University Medical Center in Columbus. There, he worked in internal medicine under supervision, responsible for dozens of vulnerable patients. Among them was a young woman named Cynthia Ann McGee, a 19-year-old college student recovering from a serious car accident. She was improving steadily, smiling again, even talking about her future. Then, one night, after Swango's shift began, Cynthia suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Nurses reported seeing Swango at her bedside moments before the monitors started to scream. Despite resuscitation efforts, she died within minutes. The cause of death was listed as a heart rhythm disturbance, but it made little sense. She had been stable hours before. Rumors swirled among staff. One nurse claimed she had seen Swango injecting Cynthia's IV line shortly before the collapse. Others remembered how he often lingered around patients who weren't in distress. Later court documents and interviews revealed that Cynthia's death was consistent with potassium chloride injection, which can stop the heart within seconds and leaves little trace in the body. She wasn't the only one. Over the course of his internship, several patients died unexpectedly, their conditions deteriorating rapidly under his care. Autopsies were rarely performed, and records were incomplete. But years later, after Swango's pattern became known, investigators exhumed some of the bodies. Laboratory tests revealed traces of poisons and lethal chemicals. The Ohio State administration came under fire for failing to act despite numerous staff complaints about Swango's behavior. In 1991, federal investigators reopened the case after Swango, by then using aliases, began applying for new medical positions across the country. Cynthia McGee's case became one of the first key examples of his suspected murders by injection. Her death, initially written off as a medical complication, would later be cited in court as part of Swango's deadly pattern. By 1993, Swango had resurfaced on the East Coast, somehow obtaining a residency position at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, Long Island, through Stony Brook University Hospital. His past conviction had slipped through the cracks due to administrative errors and incomplete background checks. To his new colleagues, he was quiet, efficient, and polite, but the pattern soon reappeared. Patients in his care began dying mysteriously. Veterans who were recovering from minor procedures suddenly went into respiratory distress. Another patient, Baron Harris, was improving well after surgery, until Swango took over his treatment. Within hours, Harris was dead. Nurses noticed a terrifying consistency. Whenever Swango was assigned to a patient, that patient often ended up in cardiac arrest. Some saw him inject syringes into IV lines unsupervised. Others found him in rooms where he wasn't scheduled to be. When questioned, he always had an explanation: checking vitals, adjusting medication, running tests. Administrators eventually began to suspect something was wrong. Internal reviews revealed that mortality rates on Swango's shifts were abnormally high. But without direct evidence of poison or foul play, they hesitated to act. Swango was quietly asked to resign. Afterward, the hospital began rechecking patient records and contacting authorities. They discovered his past criminal past and realized the magnitude of their mistake. Multiple reports were filed to the New York State Health Department and the FBI, linking Swango to a growing list of suspicious deaths stretching from Ohio to New York. But by the time these alarms reached law enforcement, Swango had already fled the country. In 1994, Swango surfaced in Zimbabwe, where he secured a position at Mini Mission Hospital, a small rural facility desperate for qualified doctors. He presented himself as Dr. Michael Kirk, claiming impressive U.S. credentials. His arrival was seen as a blessing. Within weeks, however, patients under his care began dying unexpectedly. A missionary nurse noticed a disturbing trend. Patients who were stable would suddenly collapse after receiving injections or food Swango had provided. When local surgeon Dr. John Cotton shared a meal with Swango, his wife fell violently ill soon after. Suspicious, Dr. Cotton sent samples for testing. The results showed elevated levels of arsenic, a rare poison not typically seen in rural Zimbabwe. Alarmed, Dr. Cotton contacted Zimbabwe's Ministry of Health and local police. The Zimbabwe Republic Police launched an investigation and sent their findings through Interpol to the United States. But without autopsies or conclusive forensic proof, authorities couldn't prosecute him locally. Before formal charges could be filed, Swango vanished again, this time fleeing to Namibia and later to the Middle East. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever Swango went, people died, quietly, suddenly, and without obvious cause. Hospitals from Ohio to New York and now Africa bore the same chilling fingerprint: unexplained cardiac arrests, poisoned colleagues, and a man who always moved on before suspicion could catch up. By the mid-1990s, Swango had left a trail of suffering that stretched across continents. From the paramedics of Quincy, Illinois, to the halls of Ohio State University, to the veterans of Long Island and the patients of rural Zimbabwe, his name had become synonymous with death itself.
He had poisoned friends, patients, co-workers, and even strangers out of curiosity, obsession, or perhaps something darker that no one could fully explain. Yet despite the mounting evidence, he remained a free man as he eluded capture. The question now was not whether Michael Swango had killed patients or not, but how many patients he had killed, and whether investigators could piece together the fragments of his crimes before more lives were lost. By this time, Swango had become an expert at exploiting bureaucratic gaps. Each time suspicions arose, he vanished before formal action could be taken, reappearing under a slightly altered name or with new credentials. But the case had now crossed borders, and so the U.S. Department of Justice, Interpol, and Zimbabwean authorities began coordinating efforts to track him down. The U.S. government obtained warrants and placed Swango on watch lists. Yet for years he remained elusive, moving between Africa and the Middle East. Then came the breakthrough. In June 1997, FBI agents learned that Swango was en route to Saudi Arabia, where he had secured a position at a prestigious medical center. Posing as Dr. Michael Kirk, he was scheduled to catch a connecting flight through Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Agents were waiting. As Swango stepped off the plane, calm and unsuspecting, he was surrounded and taken into custody. At the time of his arrest, investigators didn't yet have enough evidence to charge him with murder. Instead, they used fraud and perjury charges, accusing him of lying on federal employment and hospital applications. It was a strategic move. They needed him off the streets while they built the homicide case. Swango's arrest set off a global wave of reaction. Hospitals scrambled to re-examine old patient files. Families who had lost loved ones under his care began demanding answers. Doctors who had worked beside him were horrified, realizing that their former colleague may have murdered patients right in front of them. As the fraud case proceeded, prosecutors worked behind the scenes to assemble the murder evidence. They contacted forensic laboratories in Zimbabwe, Ohio, and New York, sharing toxicology results and matching chemical signatures. Autopsy samples from patients exhumed in the U.S. showed arsenic levels consistent with those found in Swango's possession years earlier. The investigation team, composed of FBI agents, Department of Justice attorneys, and medical examiners, coordinated across multiple jurisdictions. They faced tight deadlines. Swango's fraud sentence would eventually end, and if they couldn't prove murder by then, he could walk free again. Federal prosecutors decided to move strategically. Instead of pursuing dozens of complex homicide charges at once, they built a case around the most provable incidents, those with clear toxicological evidence and credible witnesses. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed hundreds of doctors, nurses, and paramedics who had worked alongside Swango. Many recalled odd coincidences, mysterious patient deaths, fainting spells after sharing food, and sudden illnesses that had no medical explanation. Some nurses broke down in tears, recounting how they had blamed themselves for patient deaths that, in hindsight, were almost certainly murders. Others described the guilt of not having spoken up sooner. The emotional toll was enormous for families, for hospital staff, and for the investigators piecing together the dark puzzle. By 1998, the case against Swango had grown into a multi-agency effort that spanned continents. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit analyzed his writings and concluded that he exhibited traits of a sadistic narcissist, a man who killed not for revenge or money, but for control and pleasure. At last, the Department of Justice announced it was ready to charge Swango with multiple counts of murder, wire fraud, and false statements to federal authorities. They presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and his own writings, enough to establish a pattern of intent. The long chase was finally nearing its end, but the investigators knew that their success came too late for dozens of victims. The evidence suggested that Swango may have killed as many as 60 people across the United States, Africa, and possibly beyond. As the case went to trial, one federal agent summarized the mood in a press conference. This wasn't just a doctor who failed his oath. This was a man who turned medicine, a tool meant to heal, into a weapon. The years of administrative reluctance, overlooked red flags, and bureaucratic silence had allowed a murderer to thrive inside hospitals. What began as quiet suspicions in Quincy had evolved into one of the horrifying medical crimes in modern history. By the time investigators finally brought Michael Swango into a federal courtroom, they weren't just seeking justice for the dead. They were exposing the systemic failures that had let him keep killing for nearly 2 decades. By the late 1990s, federal investigators had built a devastating case against Michael Swango, the charming, intelligent physician who had left a trail of unexplained deaths from Ohio to Africa. The web of deception, forged documents, and suspicious patient deaths finally collapsed under its own weight. In July 2000, a federal grand jury in New York unsealed a sweeping indictment against him. Swango was charged with 3 counts of murder, those of Cynthia Ann McGee, a patient he treated in Ohio in 1984, and 2 of his co-workers from his time at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Northport, New York, along with additional counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and making false statements to federal authorities. Prosecutors detailed how Swango, posing as a legitimate doctor, had used his medical access to poison patients and colleagues alike. They pointed to a chilling pattern: healthy patients suddenly collapsing after receiving injections from him, nurses reporting strange smells in IV bags, and a string of unexplained deaths that always seemed to follow him wherever he worked. When Swango was arrested, he initially maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a witch hunt. But prosecutors had more than circumstantial evidence. Forensic scientists had exhumed several bodies, including that of Cynthia Ann McGee, a 19-year-old gymnast who had been recovering from a car accident when she suddenly died under Swango's care in 1984. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of a substance consistent with arsenic or similar poisons.
They also presented evidence from Swango's own writings, disturbing journals recovered from his belongings, where he described his fascination with death, the thrill of watching patients die, and his desire for control over life and death. The pages painted a portrait of a man who saw himself as a godlike figure, one who decided who lived and who didn't. In court, the prosecution meticulously pieced together the pattern of death that followed him from one hospital to another, from Ohio State University to South Dakota to Illinois, and then to the VA hospital in New York. They showed records of falsified resumes and forged documents that allowed him to move freely between hospitals despite repeated complaints and suspicions. Swango's defense team tried to cast doubt on the forensic evidence, suggesting that exhumed remains could have been contaminated, or that natural causes couldn't be ruled out. They portrayed Swango as an intelligent but misunderstood man, a doctor scapegoated for systemic failures in hospital oversight. But the evidence, especially his own writings, spoke louder than any defense. As the trial neared, prosecutors in both Ohio and New York were pushing for the death penalty. But Swango, facing the very real prospect of execution or extradition to Zimbabwe, where authorities were investigating several suspicious patient deaths during his time working there, made a calculated move. In September 2000, he struck a plea deal. He agreed to plead guilty to the 3 New York murders and to the 1984 killing of Cynthia McGee in Ohio. In exchange, the death penalty would be taken off the table. Federal Judge Jacob Mishler accepted the plea and sentenced Michael Swango to 3 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole. In court, there was no visible remorse. He stood expressionless as the judge condemned him, a man trained to heal, who instead used medicine as his weapon. Family members of the victims sat silently in the gallery, some crying softly, others staring at the man who had taken so much from them. After sentencing, parts of Swango's personal notebooks were released to the public. They revealed a terrifying level of self-awareness. He wrote about the sense of power he felt when deciding whether a patient should live or die. He compared himself to an artist perfecting his craft, and he hinted at many more victims than prosecutors could ever confirm. Even with hundreds of suspicious deaths linked to his career, investigators were only able to definitively prove a handful. "We'll never know the true number," one prosecutor admitted. But the pattern is unmistakable. He was a serial killer in a doctor's coat. Following his conviction, Swango requested to be housed at the ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States, claiming that he feared for his life in regular prison due to previous attacks by other inmates. The request was granted. There, confined to a small concrete cell for 23 hours a day, he would spend the rest of his life under constant surveillance. A former physician, now caged among America's most dangerous criminals. Even in confinement, the shadow of his crimes lingered. Across continents, families still sought answers. Hospitals quietly reviewed old cases, trying to determine how many lives his hands had really taken. For many, the verdict brought closure, but for others, it only deepened the haunting question: how could so many have died before anyone stopped him? When the courtroom doors finally closed on Michael Swango, the story didn't end. In many ways, that was only the beginning. The long, painful reckoning that rippled through hospitals, medical institutions, and families across the world. For the families of his victims, there was no true closure. Many of them had lived for years without answers, wondering how their loved ones, young, strong, or recovering, could suddenly die without explanation. When they learned the truth, it wasn't just grief that consumed them, it was betrayal. They had trusted the white coat, the reassuring smile, the promise that their loved one was in good hands. But those hands were poison. The family of 19-year-old Cynthia Ann McGee, for example, had waited over 16 years for justice. Her death in 1984 was ruled suspicious but never proven, until Swango's guilty plea in 2000 finally confirmed what they had always feared. Her parents spoke publicly about the trauma of knowing that the very person who's supposed to save her life had instead taken it. "We believed in doctors," her mother said. "Now I can't walk into a hospital without wondering who's really behind that stethoscope." Across the country, former patients, colleagues, and even hospital administrators faced their own reckoning. The Swango case shook the very foundation of the medical profession. How could a man repeatedly fired or suspected of harming patients continue to find new jobs at major hospitals? In the years that followed, a storm of criticism fell on medical boards and hospital credentialing systems. Investigations revealed a shocking lack of communication between hospitals and state medical authorities. Each institution Swango worked for had quietly dismissed him when suspicions arose, but none had reported him to national databases or issued warnings to future employers. He simply moved on, starting fresh each time, his deadly pattern continuing unchecked. The New Yorker and the Journal of Ethics described the Swango case as one of the most devastating systemic failures in American medical history. It exposed the honor system that governed hospital hiring, a culture that preferred discretion over disclosure, even when lives were at stake. The scandal helped prompt reforms. One of the most significant changes was the expansion and enforcement of the National Practitioner Databank, NPDB, a federal repository designed to track malpractice claims and disciplinary actions against doctors. Established in 1990, it was meant to prevent physicians with questionable histories from quietly moving between hospitals. But before Swango's exposure, the database was rarely used or properly updated. After the Swango revelations, Congress and the medical community renewed efforts to strengthen it. Hospitals became legally obligated to report disciplinary actions, and hiring institutions were required to check the NPDB before granting privileges to a physician. While the system remains imperfect, it was a direct response to prevent another Swango from slipping through the cracks. Meanwhile, the media couldn't look away. His story became the subject of books, magazine exposés, and television documentaries. Titles like Doctor of Death and Blind Eye, the terrifying story of a doctor who got away with murder, by James B. Stewart, brought the disturbing truth to the public eye. The case fascinated and horrified audiences worldwide. The idea that a man trained to heal could instead become one of the most prolific serial killers in modern medical history. Even among his former colleagues, the psychological scars ran deep. Nurses who had worked with Swango described feelings of guilt and disbelief. Some remembered reporting their suspicions only to be dismissed as paranoid or vindictive. "We saw patients dying after his shifts," one nurse recalled. "We said something. No one believed us." For them, justice came too late, and the guilt of not being able to stop him earlier never faded.
The hospitals themselves faced lawsuits, investigations, and public outrage. Administrators were forced to answer for why they had allowed Swango to continue practicing despite red flags. Falsified credentials, strange patient outcomes, even poison found among his personal items years earlier. It was a failure of oversight, of communication, and of courage. Beyond the courts and the hospitals, the Swango case ignited broader ethical discussions about trust in the medical profession. Society relies on doctors more intimately than almost any other profession. We put our lives in their hands, often literally. The idea that a doctor could weaponize that trust shattered something fundamental in the public psyche. Medical ethicists debated a haunting question. How do you preserve trust in healers while protecting patients from those who exploit that trust? The balance between privacy, institutional reputation, and patient safety would never again be taken lightly. Even today, years after his sentencing, many of Swango's suspected victims remain unconfirmed. Investigators believe the number of deaths may reach into the hundreds, from the United States to Zimbabwe, but proving each one is nearly impossible. Many bodies were never exhumed, records were incomplete, and in some cases, evidence was lost to time. For the families still seeking answers, that uncertainty is its own torment. It's not just that he killed people, one relative told a reporter. It's that we'll never know all of their names. As for Michael Swango, he remains incarcerated at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado. There, in near-total isolation, he serves 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. No new legal actions or appeals have surfaced since his conviction. He has never admitted publicly to the full scope of his crimes, nor expressed remorse. Ultimately,
What makes Swango's crimes uniquely terrifying is not just their brutality, but their symbolism. They represent the corruption of one of humanity's most sacred roles. In the hands of a physician, vulnerability becomes absolute. And when that trust is violated, it turns medicine itself into a weapon. Swango's story is therefore more than a tale of a killer. It's a case study in what happens when oversight collapses and institutions hide behind silence. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of Michael Swango. Not the number of lives he took, but the mirror he held up to an entire profession. A mirror reflecting how easily care can turn into cruelty, how safety can become illusion, and how the line between healer and killer can disappear behind a single signature. In the end, one haunting question remains. In the hands of so-called healers, when trust becomes a weapon, how many more patients have died believing they were in safe care? Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries, places where life is preserved and pain is eased. But Swango's crimes revealed a terrifying fragility in that safety. Every chart, every syringe, every act of compassion can be corrupted by the hands that wield them. He didn't just exploit the system, he thrived because the system trusted him. Thank you for watching this video. This documentary was based entirely on verified public records, court transcripts, and official investigations. Some dramatizations were used for storytelling clarity, but every key fact and event is grounded in documented truth. Cases like Swango's remind us that real horror doesn't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes it walks through hospital halls wearing a white coat. If you found this story disturbing or eye-opening, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep-dive true crime documentaries. And tell me what you think in the comments below. Should medical institutions be held more accountable for the lives lost under their watch? Who bears the greater blame, the killer or the system that kept letting him in? Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and remember, trust once broken can be deadly.